Hello there, and welcome to another C# Intermediate tutorial. In this tutorial, we'll learn about the basics of animation. By the end of this tutorial, you've learned about animation clips, the animation component, and how to play various animations with the mannequin model that comes with the Intermediate Tutorials project. As you can see, I've opened up the Start Animations scene, and in this scene we have the default mannequin model loaded. Here on the right you can see we have our transform, our model, but nothing else. So let's first talk about how we can use animations in the Stride game engine. For animations to be played, we need animation clips. And we can import them relatively easily by clicking on Add Asset in our asset browser, going to Animation, and then here we have the animation option. If we click that, we open up our file browser and we can select a source file for animation. And this could be a 3ds, an OBJ, an FBX, any kind of model file really that contains an animation. Now, once you've done that, you will end up with something similar like this. Every animation group, like a idle or a punch animation, for example, that is a separate animation clip. And if I select that, like this one, notice how we have, in this case, a preview file selected. But let's first have a look at the various properties that come with such an animation clip. Well, at first we have the source property, which is simply referring to the model that has the actual animation stored within. In this case, it's the run.fbx file. Then we have a setting called clip duration. By default, this is toggled off, and this has the effect that the clip duration is just as long as there are actual frames inside this animation. So if you want to change that, you can adjust that with the start frame and end frame option of this clip duration property. Then we have the repeat mode hint, which is either set to play once, loop, or play once and hold, which means that by the end of the played animation, it will hold at the last frame. Then we have something called the animation type, which is either animation clip, which is by default. And lastly, we also have a difference clip for blending animations. This is outside of the scope of this tutorial. Then we have a skeleton that we can use. And luckily, we already have a preview selected here. If we select the hand icon, we can go to the model, the mannequin model skeleton, which was already imported. So in our case, we have a mannequin model, which contains a skeleton framework, if you will, which determines the bones or the ligaments of our character model. And the animation clips that we have important, they need to match the skeleton that we have for this model. For now, the only last thing that you can do for this animation clip is the preview model, which you can see I have already set so that you can use this playback here or this asset preview. You can also just drag this around yourself if you wanted to, but you can also just let it play continuously. Now what we're going to do next for our tutorial is we're going to add these animation clips to this model, and then we're going to make a custom script that starts playing these different animation clips, and we swap between them and we adjust the speeds. So let's first add a component here. Let's call it animation, and we have the animations component here, and that is a component that comes with the Stride game engine. And that basically contains just a dictionary or a list, you could call it that, of animations that you want to play. So if we click this plus key, we first have to define a key name for our animation. And this is just some way to reference the animations in script. Now in this case, I'm just going to call the first animation idle, and I'm also going to drag in this idle animation. So you could call this key something completely different, but in our case, I'm just going to name them the same because it's a nice and convenient name. So I'm going to do the same thing for punching. I do have to press enter, otherwise this doesn't work. Punching. And then finally, we have another one, which is called run. And let's drag in that run animation, which you can find in the animations folder inside our asset folder. So far, so good. Now let's make a script. So let's go to animation here. Let's make a sync script. And let's call this animation demo. And let's also attach this script to our model here. So we have our animations component and then the animations demo script that's going to control which animation will actually be playing. So now let's go over to the code. In our script, we're going to define a couple of variables. Let's first start out with a public float animation speed, where we will store the speed of the animations that are playing. We then make a private variable of type animation component, which stores the animation component that has already been attached to our model and which has the various animation clips that we want to use. Lastly, we also have a component or a class actually called playing animation. It's not included by default. We have to say using stride.animations, and that's going to store the current animation that is playing, which by default is null. I'm going to explicitly set it here to null, but you don't really have to do that. And now let's first grab that animation component, entity.get, and then the animation component. And let's also start playing an animation by default, and let's store that inside the current animation. So we can say that by saying current animation, and we're going to say animation component dot play, and then between the parentheses we can specify the key of the animation clip that we've added. So let's play the idle animation. And not only are we playing it, we're also getting a reference back to that playing animation, and that's what we're storing in this variable up here. So this is happening. If we would launch our game, our character would be idling. This is a really basic animation, so you wouldn't see that much. So let's start out by saying that if key I is pressed, then we always want to play that idling animation, no matter what. So let's say if input is key pressed, keys.I, then we basically want to do this exact line again. So even if we would play some other animation like running or punching, if I press I immediately switch to that idling animation. And since we also want to make sure that that animation has been set, let's set the time factor to that animation speed. Now let's copy this line. And let's say that if we want to start running, and I want to press R, but instead of instantly playing that running animation, I sort of want to fade over between the idling animation and the running animation. And we can use a helper function here called crossfade. So let's use that crossfade method here, which takes in, again, a string of the animation key clip or animation clip key that we want to play, which is run in this case. And let's define a time span to give an indication as how long this should take. So we can say time span from seconds, and let's say that that only takes half a second to sort of transition from that idling animation to that running animation. And again, we want to set that time factor animation speed again, so we're just going to leave that. And one last thing that I do want to do, because I think that looks really cool, is we want to influence that animation speed. Let's make a helper method to do that. So we're just going to call this adjust animation speed, which is a little method. Let's go over to it. And what we're going to say is if inputs is key pressed, and then if we press the Q key, then we want to lower the animation speed. Let's subtract a small value of it. And then, of course, we want to do something similar, only, of course, going in the opposite direction. So if we press E, then we want to increase that animation speed. And since we've adjusted the animation speed, we also need to apply that to our current animation. And it's already giving that for us in this case. Lovely. So let's try this out. Let's see what happens. So let's start our animation basics. So as you can see, our idle animation is taking place. That slight arm movement is happening. But now we want to switch to that running animations by pressing R. And notice we are now running, and there was this slight transition. Well, let's switch back instantly to the idle animation, which really is instantly. There's no crossfade happening. Well, let's press Q to slow down our animation. And notice how our arm is now barely moving. But if we press R, then we slowly fade into this crossfade into that run animation. Okay, that's looking good. Well, let's have a look at other situations that you want to be dealing with. Let's take another scenario here. Like we have this punching animation, which we can play by pressing the P key, but we only want to do that if the punching animation is not already playing. So how can we do that? So we can say if input is key pressed and then keys P. So if that's true, but also it should not be playing any punching animation that is currently playing. So we can call this animation component. And then we have this isPlaying method. And now we can say we use that key of our animation clip again. So if we're not playing the punching animation, let's play that animation. So we can do that crossfade that we did up here. Let's copy that, paste that in here. And instead of crossfading to run, we'll crossfade to the punch animation. Let's see what happens. Start the scene. Let's scale down our animation speed just slightly. So we'll start running. We'll slow down our animation speed even more. And if I press P, we get this nice, lovely punch. But what is happening then? As you can see, our animation clip is looping, and we don't want that. At the end of our animation, in this case at least, we want to stop the animation. So let's do that next. So instead of just setting the animation speed after crossfading to it, we also want to set the repeating mode. We can do that by saying current animation dot repeat mode, and then we have this enumeration where we can select our mode from. And here we see those three options that we saw earlier in the editor. And here we can say play once. Let's fill that in and run our game once more. Animation basics. Let's start running again. Slow it down just a little bit. Press P to punch. And our character is not really doing anything. It's not idling, it's not running, it's not punching. It's just done with our animation. Because that is actually what we've told Stride. Play that animation, play it once, but then we haven't really told through our script what should happen next. So let's do that next. So we can actually make another if statement here, and we can say if current animation dot name, if that is equal to that punching animation, which is actually this line, we've set crossfade to that punch. So if that is that animation, and that animation is no longer playing, we can say not playing. then we want to swap back to the idle animation again. So we can copy those lines from the idling animation when pressing I. But the only thing that we have to add here is the repeat mode, because our current animation had its repeat mode set to play once. And if we switch to the idle animation now, when the punching is done, then that repeat mode is still set to play once. So all we have to say is current animation repeat mode is repeat mode dot loop infinite. Let's give that a go. Animation basics. Let's slow it down a little bit. Let's start running. And if we press P to punch, and when it's done, it switches back to idle animation. Now, the last thing that we're going to do in this tutorial, if we press space, then we want to pause any kind of activity of the animations component. And if we press space again, we simply want to continue where we've left off. So we're going to make another method here. Let's call this pause animations. Let's generate a method out of that. And if we throw that line away, all we need to do now is say if input is key pressed, let's say keys space. If we press that key space, now inside this if statement, we can do a for each playing animation. And inside our animation component, we have both an animations dictionary, which is the actual property that you could see inside the editor. But we also have a collection called playing animations, which contains all the animations that are currently playing. And you might think that this is one animation, but since we are using crossfade, which is a sort of blend, we can have multiple animations playing at the same time. And that is why we are using this playing animations collection. But for every playing animation that we have, we can use this enabled property, and we can simply use the opposite or the negative value of that enabled value. So if it is playing, then we toggle it off by saying not playing. And we do that for all the playing animations. So let's run this one more time. And if we press animation basics, and let's say that we are running, that still works, and we have the punch. But if I press space, we now are stopping mid swing of this punch. And if I press space again, we are continuing this punch. The same thing with running. I can pause at any given moment. Well, that's it for this tutorial. See you around for the next one.